The bouquet fell first. It slipped from Emma Parker's hands before her knees gave out on the chapel floor. People were still talking outside. Laughter, car engines, the sound of heels clapping over stone. But inside, it was just her and the echo of her own heartbeat. Her wedding dress, once carefully chosen, felt like a costume she'd stolen from a happier version of herself. The text had arrived only 10 minutes before the ceremony. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." It was unsigned, but the truth didn't need a name. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her maid of honor. "Emma, I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." 2 betrayals in one morning. One from the man she was supposed to marry, another from her best friend. She stood up slowly, her fingers trembling as they reached for the bench beside her. She didn't cry. Not yet. There was a numbness in her chest, something deeper than pain. A quiet space where nothing moved, like the world was holding its breath. Emma left the church without looking back. The apartment she had shared with her ex-fiancé in Boston felt cold, clinical, like a hotel room abandoned mid-stay. She packed only what fit in her suitcase, books mostly. Her copy of Leaves of Grass, an old journal, and a photo of her parents when they were young and still believed in things like forever. She took the train out of the city 2 days later. No plans, no destination. Just a desire to be far enough away that no one would recognize her name or offer pity with their eyes. Greenfield, Massachusetts, appeared on a map like a sigh. Quiet, untouched, and mercifully anonymous. There were no wedding venues there, no flower shops specializing in roses and regret. The house she found was small, old paint peeled from the porch. The yard hadn't seen love in years, but it had a fireplace, and the kitchen window faced the sunrise. She signed the lease that same afternoon. On her first walk through the town's center, she passed a red brick building with ivy creeping up its side. A faded wooden sign read, "Greenfield Public Library." Its windows were dusty, but the door was open. Emma paused. Something about the silence inside called to her. Not the silence of heartbreak, but something gentler. She stepped through the door and into the stillness, unaware that the man who would change her life was somewhere between the shelves, watching. The library smelled of time. Not dust in a neglected sense, but the kind that lingered in pages turned by countless hands, stories read under lamplight, secrets whispered into spines. Emma stepped in slowly, her heels muffled by the aging wooden floor. The air felt cooler here, stiller. A place where words waited, not rushed. She wandered past tall shelves packed tightly with books in faded jackets. There was no hum of computers, no children chattering, no signs of modern life. Just the whisper of paper and a ticking clock somewhere out of sight. Near the back, she found a reading table, scratched and worn, but lit by a shaft of golden sunlight from a skylight above. She sat. Not to read, not yet. Just to exist. To listen. To breathe. "You're new," came a voice, soft and low. Emma turned. A man stood a few feet away, holding a stack of books. He was dressed in simple clothes, jeans, a gray sweater with worn cuffs. His beard was short and uneven, like he trimmed it without much care. But his eyes were quiet and searching, like he read more than just books. "I just moved here," Emma said cautiously. He nodded. "Welcome to Greenfield." She expected him to introduce himself, to ask for her name. He didn't, just offered a faint smile and moved past her, sliding the books onto a shelf with the reverence of a priest tending to sacred objects. "Do you work here?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder. "You could say that." That was all. Over the next few days, Emma returned. It became routine. Coffee at sunrise, a walk through the dewy air, then hours among the books. Each time the man was there, rearranging volumes, dusting shelves, fixing squeaky drawers. He never wore a name tag, never asked questions, but he always greeted her, sometimes with a quote, sometimes with silence. "The right book at the right time," he said once, handing her a slim poetry collection without explanation. It was exactly what she needed. She didn't know his story, but he didn't ask hers either. And that was its own kind of kindness. One rainy afternoon, she brought her journal. She hadn't written since before the wedding. Words had abandoned her then, but now they returned, cautious, like birds testing the sky after a storm. And from the far end of the room, the man watched her write, his gaze soft, unreadable, as if he recognized something in her silence. It took Emma a week to learn his name, not because he told her, but because she caught it scribbled on the edge of a return slip. Ethan Reed. The handwriting was neat, all caps, with loops that curved deliberately. Like someone who had once cared deeply about letters, she didn't say anything. It felt wrong to acknowledge something he hadn't offered freely. Instead, she tucked the name away like a bookmark between chapters. Ethan, as she now called him silently, never pried. He didn't ask what had brought her to Greenfield or why she spent entire afternoons thumbing through poetry as if trying to feel something between the lines. But he noticed things, like the day she brought a thermos of tea and he quietly placed a coaster beside her elbow without a word, or when she reached for a book on a high shelf and found it already moved to a lower one the next day. She watched him more now. The way he moved through the library wasn't like a worker tending a building. It was more like a guardian minding a sanctuary. He paused before each shelf, fingers tracing titles, as if remembering who last borrowed each one. He spoke to the books sometimes, not in full sentences, but in murmurs. A nod here, a faint chuckle there. Emma wondered if anyone else had ever noticed that. One day, curiosity won over silence. "Do you live here?" she asked. He didn't look up from the book he was shelving. "Sort of." "That's not really an answer." He glanced over. "It's not really a question." Emma smiled for the first time in what felt like months. Later that afternoon, she found him sitting near the poetry section, reading something by Mary Oliver. Without invitation, she sat across from him. "Do you ever get tired of the quiet?" she asked. He closed the book, slowly. "Noise is louder when it comes from the inside." The words landed with a weight that silenced her. "I used to teach literature," she said suddenly, "before I stopped believing in what I said." He studied her. "And now? I'm trying to believe again." Ethan nodded, thoughtful. "Start with someone else's words. The rest will follow." He stood and left her with the book. Emma opened it and read the first poem aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. And Ethan, out of sight, paused behind a shelf and listened as her voice threaded through the silence, like wind through trees that hadn't rustled in a long, long time. The days began folding into each other like pages of a well-loved novel. Emma's life took on a rhythm, quiet, intentional, restorative. Every morning, she walked to the library through streets painted with the golds and reds of early autumn, her journal tucked beneath her arm like a secret waiting to be told. Ethan was always there before her. He never greeted her the same way twice. One morning, he handed her a collection of Rainer Maria Rilke's letters without speaking. Another day, he placed a small, folded note between the pages of a novel she was browsing. It read, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart." No signature, just ink, paper, and presence. He didn't ask her why she wrote. She didn't ask him why he stayed. They sat together now, sometimes without speaking for hours. She wrote. He read. Occasionally, one of them would share a line from a book or a thought too heavy to carry alone. Their silences became a language all their own. One particularly cold afternoon, the wind rattled the library windows like fingers testing glass. Emma arrived shivering, cheeks flushed, eyes tired. Ethan met her at the door with a thick gray blanket draped over one arm and a book of frost poems in the other. Today calls for fire and verses, he said simply. She followed him to the reading room in the back, where an old wood-burning stove warmed the air. They settled into armchairs that creaked with memory. Ethan read aloud, his voice smooth, low, and almost apologetic, as if he didn't want to startle the poems. Emma listened, eyes closed, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea he had somehow produced from behind the counter. The warmth spread from her fingers to her chest. "You read like you've lived every word," she murmured when he paused. Ethan smiled faintly. "Some words read you first." She shared her writing that evening. Not with fanfare, just a page slid silently across the table. A poem about betrayal and broken glass, and how sometimes the pieces still catch light. Ethan read it slowly, lips moving with each word. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes unreadable. "You write like someone who's survived the storm, but still listens for thunder." Emma didn't reply. She didn't need to. For the first time since arriving in Greenfield, she felt seen. Not as someone healing, but as someone whole, even in the process of mending. And that night, as she walked home beneath a canopy of stars, she realized she was beginning to feel something dangerous again. Hope. The knock at Emma's door came just after sunrise. She opened it to find Mr. Langford, the owner of the cottage she rented. He was an older man with a permanent scowl and a voice like gravel. He carried a clipboard and a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm selling the property," he said, without preamble. "You'll need to vacate by the end of the month." Emma's breath caught. "But I signed a lease." Langford shrugged. Month to month. Perfectly legal. She stood there, stunned, the chill of the morning seeping through the threshold. "Unless," he added, tapping his pen against the clipboard, "you've got a more permanent situation here. Husband? Family?" Emma shook her head. The door closed slowly between them, but the echo of that word, husband, lingered long after. She didn't tell Ethan right away. She didn't want his pity, didn't want to appear fragile, but her silence must have spoken louder than words, because a few days later, he asked gently, "Everything all right?" Emma hesitated, then nodded no. He listened quietly as she explained, seated in their usual corner of the library. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment, then said something she hadn't expected. "You could marry me." She blinked. "What?" "It'd solve your housing issue. As my spouse, you'd have rights to stay. Langford wouldn't be able to push you out." "That's not a reason to get married." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Maybe not, but sometimes survival makes strange proposals." They didn't tell anyone. There was no ceremony, no white dress, no family gathered with nervous smiles and tissue-filled pockets. Just a courthouse on a rainy Tuesday morning, a pen that barely worked, and two names signed on a line. Emma wore a navy blue sweater and jeans. Ethan wore the same gray coat he always did. Their rings were metaphorical, their vows unspoken. Afterward, they went back to the library as if nothing had changed. But something had. She noticed it when he handed her a new journal, leather-bound, untouched. "A new chapter," he said softly. She noticed it when he made space for her things on a shelf behind the front desk. She noticed it when she caught herself reaching for his hand while they read beside the fire and didn't pull away. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something steady, something kind, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she belonged somewhere again. Not just to a place, but to a rhythm, a presence, a quiet promise made without words. The library had begun to feel like a home. Not just for Emma, but for the version of herself she thought she'd lost. The one who used to underline favorite lines in books, who believed in the small, sacred magic of shared silence. Life with Ethan wasn't grand or romantic in the way movies promised. It was better. It was real. They developed a rhythm. Mornings were for quiet coffee, and pages turned slowly. Afternoons for shelving, reading, writing. Evenings brought long walks, laughter in short bursts, and dinners cooked in companionable quiet. There was no pressure to explain their arrangement. Greenfield wasn't the kind of town that asked questions if you didn't volunteer answers. But even as things grew warmer between them, a sliver of distance remained. A door in Ethan's soul that Emma could never quite open. She learned his habits, his favorite tea, the way he tapped the spine of a book twice before shelving it, that he preferred writing in pencil, that he never carried a phone. But she didn't know where he went after she fell asleep on the couch, or why some nights he sat outside staring at the stars like they owed him an answer. She wanted to ask, but she was afraid that knowing the truth might change the way she looked at him. One evening, they shared a bottle of wine and read aloud from a short story collection. Emma's voice grew bolder with each sip, her laughter echoing between the stacks. Ethan watched her with a softness that made her heart ache. "You never talk about yourself," she said suddenly, lowering the book. He raised an eyebrow. "I talk. About books, not you." Ethan paused. Some things don't need to be said out loud. Emma leaned forward, eyes searching. "I want to know you, Ethan, not just the library you hide inside." He looked away. "I'm not hiding," he said quietly. "I'm healing." The silence stretched between them like a thread pulled taut. Emma nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. "So am I." He reached for her hand, not in apology, not in affection, but in understanding. Their fingers met and stayed. That night, she left a poem on his pillow, one of her own. It spoke of walls made of words, of doors that open only when knocked on gently. He didn't say anything the next day, but the poem was gone. And in its place, a new book sat waiting for her, unmarked, unfamiliar, full of blank pages, a journal for a future neither of them had yet dared to name. The first snow fell gently, cloaking Greenfield in silence deeper than the libraries. Emma arrived early that morning, brushing flakes from her coat as she stepped into the warmth. Ethan was already there, kneeling near the back shelves, sorting through a stack of returns. He greeted her with a quiet nod and resumed his work. She wandered the aisles aimlessly, letting her fingers graze the spines of old favorites until she reached a corner she rarely visited. Local authors, limited prints, forgotten names. Something caught her eye. A leather-bound manuscript with no label on the spine, just a faded symbol, 3 stars above a tree. She pulled it free. Inside, the title page read, "The Quiet Ones" by E.R. Wilder. It wasn't a name she recognized, but the prose stopped her breath. It was like reading Ethan's eyes. The voice on the page was soft and observant, each sentence laced with grief and wonder, as if someone had taken silence and turned it into ink. She flipped to the dedication. for the one who made me believe I could write again. I lost her before I could say thank you." Emma's throat tightened. She brought the book to the front desk. Ethan looked up from his notes, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely startled. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In the back," she said. "It's yours, isn't it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the ledger in front of him, folded his hands, and sat back like a man who had just been asked to confess a lifetime. "My real name is Ethan Wilder," he said softly. "E.R. Wilder. I wrote under that name for years." Emma felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. "But you stopped," she said. He nodded. "After my wife died, I couldn't write another word. I couldn't speak to the world without her in it." The silence stretched again, not cold this time, but heavy with truth. "You're a best-selling author," she said, almost laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. "I was," he said. "I didn't want to be him anymore, so I disappeared, changed towns, started over, found this." He gestured around the library. "It became my shelter." Emma held the book to her chest, eyes brimming. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to see him," Ethan said. "I wanted you to see me." And for the first time since their marriage, Emma didn't know if she was looking at the man she loved or the stranger she'd never really met. The book stayed on her kitchen table all night. She didn't sleep. Each time Emma tried to close her eyes, sentences from the quiet ones echoed in her mind. They weren't just beautiful, they were familiar. The way he described grief, how he folded silence into meaning. It was him, the man she had slowly learned to trust, to care for, to build a fragile peace with. But he had never told her. The next morning, she stood in the reading room, coat still on, the book clutched in her hand like evidence. "You lied to me," she said. Her voice didn't rise, but it shook with something deeper than anger. Disappointment. Ethan looked up from the counter. He didn't flinch. "I didn't lie. You hid who you were." He set his pen down. "I didn't think it mattered." "It does," she snapped. "Not because you're famous, Ethan. Because you didn't trust me. You said we were healing together, but you've been hiding in plain sight." He stepped around the counter slowly, hands open, careful. "Emma, I didn't tell you because I was afraid the truth would take me back to the version of myself I was trying to leave behind. And I didn't want to risk this. Us." She stared at him. "This," she said, gesturing between them, "was built on silence, and I thought that made it sacred. But it was just fear, wasn't it?" Ethan didn't answer, and in that space where an apology should have lived, something broke. Emma packed that afternoon. She didn't take much, just what she came with, and the journal Ethan had given her, still half empty. She left the key on the kitchen counter and a note in the library's Dropbox. It read, "Some stories aren't finished, but that doesn't mean they belong on the shelf forever." She didn't leave a return address. Winter settled fully into Greenfield. The days were shorter, the wind sharper. Without Emma, the library felt cavernous. Ethan kept it open for a few days, lighting the stove, arranging the chairs as if she might walk back in at any moment. She didn't. 1 week later, a sign appeared on the door. "Closed until further notice." Inside, the lights stayed off. The dust returned, and the chair she always sat in remained untouched, as if waiting for a voice that might never fill the room again. And Ethan, once a man of many words, sat alone in the silence he had once believed was safe, now echoing with the absence of the woman who had made it feel like home. Spring returned to Greenfield quietly, as if afraid to disturb the hush winter had left behind. Emma hadn't meant to come back. Not really. The literary conference invitation had arrived in her inbox months ago, back when snow still lined the windows of her new apartment in Boston. She'd almost deleted it. But something, nostalgia, restlessness, unfinished chapters, made her accept. She told herself it was just a few days, nothing more. The town hadn't changed much. The cafe still served bitter coffee and chipped mugs. The air still smelled of pine and paper. But the library was different. Its doors stood open now, framed by freshly painted trim and flower boxes in bloom. New lights glowed warmly through the windows. The old sign, Greenfield Public Library, had been replaced with a new one in bronze. Beneath it, the Emma Wilder Reading Room. Her breath caught. She stepped inside. The space was both familiar and new. The fire still crackled in the stove. The old reading chairs remained in their places, their worn arms now lovingly restored. But there were new touches, too. Photographs of poets on the walls, quotes in careful calligraphy, fresh rugs and tables, and books. So many books. She wandered through the aisles, trailing her fingers along the shelves until a name stopped her cold. Wilder, Ethan, Emma. The cover was soft cream linen, the title in delicate gold foil. No subtitle, no summary, just her name. Hands trembling, she opened it. Inside was poetry. Not just about love or grief or the hush between sentences, but about her. Verses about rainy afternoons and chamomile tea, about blank pages and quiet courage, about a girl who left and the silence she took with her. It was raw, honest, beautiful. In the preface, one line stood alone. To the one who taught me that love is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stay despite it. Tears blurred the text. She closed the book gently, hugging it to her chest. Later, she found the librarian, a young woman who smiled with recognition. "Are you?" Emma nodded. "He dedicated the whole renovation to you," the woman said. "Said you reminded him why libraries matter, why stories matter." She didn't ask where Ethan was. She wasn't ready. Not yet. But she knew something now. The silence between them had always been a chapter break, not the end. And in this new story, her name wasn't just written on a page. It had become part of the walls. The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall library windows, casting golden stripes across the floor. Dust danced in the light, like memories in motion. Emma stood quietly at the threshold of the reading room, her heart beat louder than any sound in the building. Ethan was there. He hadn't seen her yet. He was kneeling near the poetry section, carefully reorganizing the shelves, one book at a time, one title at a time, like it mattered deeply where each belonged. The same gray coat draped across the back of his chair, the same soft concentration in his brow. She didn't speak. She simply watched. The room felt both impossibly small and endlessly wide. Then he turned. His eyes met hers. No shock, no question, just stillness, recognition, something deep and quiet and aching. Ethan rose slowly, the weight of months in every movement. He didn't say her name. She didn't expect him to. Instead, he reached behind the desk and retrieved a book. Worn leather, familiar binding. He stepped toward her, slow, deliberate, and handed it over without a word. Tucked inside, halfway through, was a bookmark. Handwritten, ink smudged in places. It was her poem, one she had written months ago, the last one she had left behind. I am not the wind, but the echo after, the silence that waits and hopes you'll listen. Emma's hands shook slightly as she held the pages. She looked up. Ethan's eyes shimmered. No mask now. No walls. Just a man standing inside the ruins he had tried to live in. Finally brave enough to invite her back. She stepped forward. No speeches, no apologies. Just arms opening slowly. And then, a hug. Quiet. Fierce. Fragile. Like holding a broken thing finally mended. He buried his face into her shoulder. She pressed her forehead into his chest. And in that space between breaths, between regrets and hopes, they found something that didn't need explaining. The library seemed to exhale around them. Outside, the wind stirred the cherry blossoms. Inside, the shelves stood taller. The lights seemed warmer. And for the first time in a long, long time, the story felt not like an ending, but a beginning. Because the library was open again. And so were their hearts. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional narratives like this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of the story touched you the most. Your support means the world and helps bring more stories to life.